This video is a copy of the sermon that will be preached on September the 11th at North Shields Evangelical Church. Before listening to it, if you could read Genesis chapter 40 and Genesis chapter 41. Now, every story begins with an inciting incident, a key moment or significant event that thrusts the story into action. First, you introduce the characters, the villain, the poor boy and the beautiful princess, who the poor boy doesn't have a chance with. And then, boom, Aladdin gets 3 wishes and suddenly a massive new adventure begins. Or you meet an ordinary young New York photographer, and then boom, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider and gains superpowers, and now he has to decide how he's going to use them. Or you meet some naive kids, a few dinosaur experts, and someone who's just here for the ride, and then boom, the electric fence of Jurassic Park fails, and suddenly all the escaped dinosaurs are seeking to cause as much pain and destruction as they can. After introducing the characters, in every story you get the inciting incident, the boom moment around which the rest of the story is based. In chapter 41, when Joseph goes from rags to riches, you'd think we'd have reached the end of our story. Joseph has finally arrived at his happy ending as his suffering ceases and his time of power and privilege begins. We might think this is the end of the story, but it's actually the inciting incident, the key event around which the rest of the story is based. How will Joseph use this new opportunity? How will he respond to those who've hurt him in the past? How will Joseph use his newfound power? These are the questions this inciting incident raises. And if we look back at each character's introduction, you'll understand why. Chapter 37, which introduces Joseph's brothers, tells us that Joseph's brothers hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. And so they plotted to kill him. And they sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. Later on, these brothers will return to Egypt looking for food and have to look powerful Joseph in the eye. Will this be the moment that Joseph goes rampant with his powers and causes his brothers as much pain as possible? Well, we're about to find out. Then we've got chapter 39, which introduces the first Egyptians that Joseph encounters. It tells us about Potiphar, who was an Egyptian, one of Pharaoh's officials. He was an official who entrusted to Joseph's care everything he owned, and the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. But then Potiphar took Joseph and put him in prison. Later on, it will be Potiphar, like many others in Egypt, who will be asking Joseph for mercy. Will Joseph use his 3 wishes to show them mercy, now that the tables have been turned? Then we've got chapter 40, which introduces the king's cupbearer. It tells us that the king's cupbearer was put in the same prison where Joseph was confined, and Joseph attended them. And one day this cupbearer looked dejected, and Joseph showed him kindness, giving him hope that he'd eventually be released from prison. But the cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot about him. Joseph had served this and many other Egyptians, only to be ignored. Would Joseph continue using his power to serve such Egyptians? Or would Joseph wipe his hands of them and cease to care? Everything before chapter 41 has just been character introductions. And now we arrive at our boom moment, and suddenly the real theme of the story begins. How will Joseph respond to those who have ignored him, rejected him, and caused him so much pain? But why does this matter? Well, I suspect that at some point in your life, you'll find yourself asking one or more of the following questions. What's God's attitude to me after X? Like Joseph's brothers, we've all things in our past that should make us feel uncomfortable if we looked God in the eye. Can we still come near to such a God seeking his kindness? Or should we keep our distance and expect nothing but a frown? This might be a question for which you're unsure or nervous about the answer. Or maybe another question: has God wiped his hands of humanity? Like Joseph, God has served us. He's given us every good thing that we have. But for a large part, we've forgotten about him and ignored him. Is God still interested in the people that he has created? This might be a question that you ask when you look at yourself or the world or the names of people on your prayer list. Or maybe you're asking another question: how does God react when the tables are turned? Joseph's brothers profited from selling Joseph into slavery. Later they'd experience poverty and be begging rich Joseph for food. Potiphar used his power to send Joseph to prison. Later he'd be powerless to feed himself, and Joseph would be his only hope. The cupbearer forgot about Joseph for 2 years. Later, as a hungry Egyptian, he'd be asking for 2 minutes of Joseph's time. And how often we find ourselves in the same situation. We ignore God, then ask for God's help. We condemn others, then ask for God's mercy for ourselves. We enjoy life's good things and ignore God. But when faced with life's bad things, we immediately ask God for his attention. Does God treat us based on the principle of like for like? Or is God genuinely gracious? This ancient story answers so many of the questions we're still asking. So what is the answer? Well, verse 55 of chapter 41. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." Joseph's experience of the Egyptian people had hardly been positive up before this moment. He served them, sought their best interests. They'd greatly benefited from all that he'd done for them. And yet Joseph had been repaid by being thrown into prison and forgotten. So what is Joseph's response now going to be when the whole of Egypt was in need? Verse 56. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. Joseph continued to seek the salvation, the physical salvation of the people who'd rejected him. And in the story of Joseph, we're given a foretaste of the story of someone else. Matthew chapter 20, verse 17. Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem. On the way he took the 12 aside and said to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, to be mocked and flogged and crucified. On the third day he will be raised to life." Like Joseph, God's Son, Jesus, spent his life serving others and seeking humanity's best interests. And yet how did the world repay him? By nailing him to a cross. After this kind of treatment, How should Jesus have responded? Well, I think the words of Florence Welsh, a secular musician, summarise what Jesus' response could so easily have been. In her song Free, she says, "Oh, like Christ upon a cross, who died for us, who died for what? Oh, don't you wanna call it off? Call it off, Jesus. Stop seeking humanity's best interests. The cross was the time for God's love towards the world to end." And yet Jesus rose from the dead and, like Joseph, continued seeking the salvation of the world. Well, why does this matter? Well, if you're not a Christian, you need to know that God has not called off his interest in saving you, no matter how you've treated him in the past. That salvation, that biblical word, means saving from the guilt of the wrong things we've done, the guilt of our rejection of God, and salvation from death when we die. God's offer of salvation is still an offer to you. Now it's up to you to take it. But what about if you are already a Christian? Well, if you've ever watched the full Eurovision Song Contest / experienced living torture, then you'll know it's not actually the Eurovision Song Contest. It's the Euro Opinion Contest. For example, Italy beat England in the Euro 2020 final. So this year the UK awarded Italy 0 points. The 2 years the UK were negotiating leaving the EU, the UK came last in the Eurovision Song Contest. If Russia ever gets back to participating in Eurovision, people will vote based on their opinion of Russia, not on their opinion of the song. It's facts like this that make Joseph's treatment towards Egypt so shocking. For the book of Genesis would have been read by ancient Jews, those who'd spent years in Egypt. They knew how ungodly Egypt was. They'd been on the receiving end of hatred. They'd watched as the Egyptians stood back and watched Jewish children drowned in the River Nile. Their interest in seeing God save the Egyptian people would be zero. And yet Genesis reminds them of Joseph, God's servant, who didn't turn his back on Egypt, no matter how badly they treated him. In other words, if Joseph, God's servant, didn't turn his back on the world, then neither should they. Now what about you, if you are a Christian? You might see an ungodly world around you. You might see hostility to the Christian message. You might see people disinterested towards the subjects of God and of Jesus Christ. Joseph didn't turn his back on such a world. Jesus didn't turn his back on such a world. So neither should we. We need to pray confidently, remembering that God has not called off his plan to save people in 21st century UK. I often pray not expecting God to answer. Surely God's not interested in saving people anymore. But the stories of Joseph and Jesus remind me of God's continual love for the world. We also need to live as if God is actually concerned about the lives of those who are non-Christians. I show a polite interest in other people at work, but not really a genuine interest. The story of Joseph and Jesus remind me how interested in people God actually is. We need to keep seeking the salvation of the world around us by speaking about Jesus. I have other agendas in life which I'd much prefer to pursue. But the stories of Joseph and Jesus show me that God makes the salvation of people his primary concern. Next, we come to Joseph's response to his brothers. Chapter 42, verse 1. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, Joseph's brothers. "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" he continued. "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us, so that we may live and not die." Joseph's brothers headed to Egypt expecting a give and take relationship. They'd give the leader of Egypt money, then they'd take back the corresponding amount of grain. Give and take, like for like, both parties even Stevens at the end. But what if Joseph did decide to get even Stevens with his brothers? What if Joseph did treat his brothers like they treat him? They'd sought to kill Joseph and then sent him far away to Egypt. And yet this is Joseph's response to them. Chapter 45, verse 9. "Come down to me in Egypt. Don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me. I will provide for you. Otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute." Then Joseph kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Joseph invites his brothers, who'd sent him packing, to draw near to him. Joseph saves the life of those who'd wanted him killed. Joseph treats his enemies like friends. The story of Joseph is not a like-for-like story, a story about give and take. It's a story about grace, undeserved favor, extreme kindness towards who don't deserve it. Thank God that the story of Jesus is the same. I'll just read a few verses. God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. For it is by grace you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works. Imagine if the Christian faith was based on the principle of like for like, give and take. Imagine if God's attitude to you in the morning was based on your attitude towards him in the past. Imagine if God kept a list titled Even Stevens, which he always looked at before he looked at you. Imagine if you had to give stuff to God before you could be confident of his favour. These foundational verses remind us that the Christian faith is not, and never has been, based on the principle of like for like, give and take. Instead, it is based on the underlying principle of mercy and grace. Because of Jesus, God invites you to draw near to him. Because of Jesus, God treats past enemies like friends. Because of Jesus, God has ripped up his even Stevens list. Because of Jesus, God's favour towards you does not go up or down. Just as Joseph paid a price in order to save his brothers, so too Jesus paid a price to fully save and accept you. And since we've more in common with Joseph's brothers than we care to admit, this is a very reassuring